Greetings, Mayor, Mayor Pro Tem, member of the City Council, and members of the public. This item is regarding the Just Cause Evictions and Tenant Protections Just Cause Code Amendment and Resolution establishing administrative regulations to implement the rent stabilization and just cause ordinances. This is Alba Marshall, Rent Stabilization and Just Cause Eviction Program Supervisor for the Oxnard Housing Department. Background: on April 13, 2022, City Council adopted the Just Cause Evictions and Other Tenant Protections Just Cause Ordinances, which became effective June 2nd, 2022. On January 25th, 2024, City Council approved amending specific provisions of Section 27-4 of the Just Cause Ordinance regarding the no-fault just cause evictions occurring as a result of demolition or substantial remodel. In order to provide maximum protection for renters, the provisions were adopted through a urgency ordinance, ordinance number 3041, and subsequently a non-urgency ordinance, ordinance number 3042, which was adopted on February 6, 2024. On July 30th, 2024, City Council approved an omnibus city code update that amended both ordinances. Discussion. During the past 2 years, staff have observed emerging issues that hinder the effectiveness of the Just Cause Ordinance, Ordinance number 3012. In response, staff recommends strengthening the ordinance by amending Section 27-3 and Section 27-4. In addition to the proposed ordinance amendments, staff recommend the adoption of 4 administrative regulations. The administrative regulations provide enhanced clarity and administrative guidance that support the implementation of both the Just Cause Ordinance and the Rent Stabilization Ordinance. Ordinance Amendment Section 27-3. Section 27-3 describes the various scenarios under which a property owner can terminate tenancy under at-fault just cause reasons. Staff have witnessed a steady increase in at-fault based termination notices being issued by property owners when a roommate whose occupancy was allowed under the lease or rental agreement moves out and the remaining tenants or tenant attempt to replace the roommate who left. By terminating the tenancy for an alleged fault-based reason, property owners can circumvent the rent stabilization ordinance and establish a new, higher rent amount for the subsequent tenancy. The proposed amendment clarifies that a property owner may not terminate the tenancy of a tenant who simply replaces one roommate with another, so long as the tenant continues to reside in the rental unit and replaces a departed roommate who had a right to occupy the rental unit under a lease or rental agreement on a one-for-one basis. Property owners will still have the ability to object to the replacement roommate. Ordinance Amendment Section 27-4A. Section 27-4A describes a property owner's ability to take back possession of their rental unit to either reoccupy the rental unit themselves or house a close family member. If a property owner intends to take back possession, they must submit an affidavit to the city within 10 days of serving the tenant a termination notice, but does not require property owners to provide a copy to the tenant. The proposed amendment will require owners who intend to take back possession and reoccupy the rental unit to serve the tenant a copy of the affidavit and termination notice simultaneously. In addition, the proposed amendment will require both documents to be filed with the city within 5 days rather than 5 days for the termination notice and 10 days for the affidavit. This amendment eliminates the confusion caused by having 2 different deadlines for each document to be filed with the city. The proposed amendment also clarifies the requirements for existing tenancies that predated the ordinance. Ordinance Amendment Section 27-13. Section 27-10B of the Just Cause Ordinance requires all owners subject to the ordinance pay a program fee as established by City Council. Having this information in a subsection embedded within Section 27-10 makes it difficult for the public to locate. Finally, the language differs from the language used in the fee section of the Rent Stabilization Ordinance. The proposed amendment would remove Section 27-10B and add Section 27-13. As drafted, Section 27-13 mirrors the fee establishment language that is provided under the Rent Stabilization Ordinance. In addition to creating consistency, the information will now be easier to locate by the public. In Administrative regulations. Oxnard City Code Sections 27-10A and 27-28.1 authorizes the city manager to adopt administrative regulations that support the implementation of the Just Cause Ordinance and Rent Stabilization Ordinance. Staff recommends adoption of 4 administrative regulations to enhance clarity and provide administrative guidance. Registration regulations. Section 27-29 requires owners of property subject to the Rent Stabilization Ordinance to pay a fee to implement and enforce that ordinance. And proposed Section 27-13, amended Section 27-10B described earlier in this presentation, requires owners of property subject to the Just Cause Evictions and Tenant Protection Ordinance to pay a fee to implement and enforce that ordinance. The proposed regulation will require all rental properties subject to the Section 27-29 and Section 27-13 be registered with the city. First, right of refusal regulations. The purpose of this regulation is to clarify the rights and responsibilities of owners and tenants when a tenant is displaced due to a substantial remodel, as defined by the Just Cause Evictions and Tenant Protection Ordinance under Section 27-4D. This regulation clarifies that if an affected tenant has a right to return to the rental unit from which the tenant was displaced, the property owner must offer to re-rent the unit to the affected tenant at the same rental rate that would have applied if the tenant had never been displaced. If no rent increase has been proposed within the last 12 months, then return at the same rental rate plus 4% without requiring the tenant to complete or submit a new rental application or pay any type of fee, and without imposing any other type of requirement that the owner could not have imposed during the affected tenancy before the tenant was displaced. Fair rate of return petition. Under Rent Stabilization Ordinance Section 27-23, an owner may petition the city for an increase in rent so that the owner may obtain a fair and reasonable return. The ordinance currently provides for this process in conformity with the California Supreme Court's opinion in Birkenfield versus City of Berkeley, but sets forth no standard by which an owner's receipt or non-receipt of a fair return is to be determined. The proposed regulation fills in this gap by establishing the formula to determine whether a petitioning owner is receiving a fair and reasonable return, establishing a mandatory petition and decision-making process. Ellis Act regulations. The Ellis Act prohibits local governments from stopping property owners from going out of business with respect to rental property. It also allows local governments to further adopt regulations that prevent owners from abusing the right to withdraw their properties from the rental market. The city complies with the act. However, regulations that provide the ability to monitor and enforce compliance with these specific terminations have not been adopted. Currently, owners can give a notice of intent to withdraw under the act, wait for the move out, and re-rent the unit at market level. Owners can also claim they are withdrawing the property via the act and choose to sell the home without following the proper procedures under this act. The proposed regulations will close a loophole by adopting the tenant protections that the Ellis Act authorizes cities to adopt, and will provide the ability to monitor and enforce these protections. Recommendation that the Community Services, Public Safety, Housing and Development Committee review the proposed ordinance that will amend the Oxnard City Code regarding the Just Cause Evictions and Other Tenant Protections Ordinance, and recommend that the City Council approve the first reading by title only and waive further reading of the proposed ordinance titled Ordinance of the City of Oxnard, California, amending sections 27-3, 27-4, and 27-10, and adding section 27-13 to the Oxnard City Code, and review and recommend that the City Council approve the proposed resolution establishing administrative regulations to implement the provisions of the Just Cause Evictions and Other Tenant Protections Ordinance and Rent Stabilization Ordinance. This concludes my presentation. Thank you for your time.